This is a really important conversation that we're having today in the context of a real racial reckoning in this country where enough is enough and Black Lives Matter. How do we make this moment truly matter, both personally as well as policy professionals?
I think it's really great that we are finally having a conversation about this within the Black community, and I'm certain other people of color, immigrants, etc. These are conversations we have regularly, and it's always a surprise that no one seems to understand why we are hurt and angry. So I think the first step is always to have a real look at ourselves. I think one thing that we're not talking that much about, but is of course also in the media, is the Amy Cooper video. And in some ways, I think that one was much more poignant, but we don't often see captured on video the same insidiousness with which a supposed liberal could so quickly go to a place where she could threaten a man's life because of her own race and historic relations.
Chris, when you put your foreign policy lens on what is happening in this country and you look at US-Africa relations, what do you see?
Tough times to be a Black man in the United States. That's the only way I could summarize what we've been going through in the past few months. There are also tough times for people such as myself who work in the democracy and human rights and foreign policy arena that have been doing work in Africa and other parts of the developing world, and in some cases have used UX examples as illustrations of how democracy could work and how human rights could be respected and how civil-military relations or relations between security services and civilian populations could be maintained and fostered. And so I think this is going to influence the way that the US deals with its international relations, especially with regards to the African continent. I haven't seen anything like this in the past 30 years that I've tracked US-Africa relations. And I think that a lot of effort is going to have to go into building up those relationships because they're at their lowest point right now.
There seems to be an inability to connect the dots when it comes to the impact of colonialism, slavery, indentured servitude, all the things that have impacted persons of African descent. So whether we're in the Americas or whether we're in Africa.
So the question becomes, how do you transform where people want to be overtly passionate but how do you make that into real reform? So for me, those are the challenges of foreign policy professional is really figuring out how to navigate those true people-to-people ties and the hypocrisy tendency.
It's a really important opportunity for US policymakers, and especially those of us who talk a lot about democracy and enfranchisement and civil and political rights. It's an opportunity for us to think about how you continue to stick to your principles, have the courage of your convictions, and simultaneously have the exercise in humility, right, of acknowledging the gross injustices, the systemic racism, the deep, deep problems in one's own society. And that requires a lot of reflection, a lot of work, a difference both in substance and in tone. But I am incredibly impressed with so many of our diplomats overseas right now who've taken it upon themselves, right, to wrestle with these issues in incredibly honest and courageous and personal ways. And I think they're helping to kind of provide some guideposts for all the rest of us.
Let me say that this is an extraordinarily difficult time for US diplomats in Africa, but also across the world. I think it has been extremely important for the way a number of our diplomats overseas have comported themselves. Diplomats swear an allegiance to the Constitution and not to a president or to a political party. And we don't swear allegiance to values and principles that are illegal and reprehensible. So I think it's really important that we continue to stand up and make sure that we speak out clearly, even if it challenges the norms of those who may be above us. It is important to represent our principles and values, and it's absolutely important that we indeed do a much better job here in the United States of ensuring that there is inclusion. We should never back away from the importance of Black Lives Matter. It is important to demonstrate that every American has the ability to speak out against injustice.
I think that we have a tendency in our foreign policy to speak more vociferously the further away from us a problem is. Because if we speak about things close to us, we impugn ourselves. But if we speak about things thousands of miles away, it's easy to have the kind of moral authority that we purport to have. I thought about some of the tension in the Congressional Black Caucus during my time on Capitol Hill, when people wanted to make statements about Boko Haram, when people wanted to make statements about issues of human rights violations in South Sudan. And you had staff members and colleagues saying, well, wait a minute, Baltimore is on fire and we didn't say anything about Freddie Gray. Ferguson is on fire and we didn't say anything about Michael Brown. So how can we talk about death and human rights violations, 9,000, 10,000 miles away? At the same time, to the point that Chris was making, you can see some of the comments coming from the continent, the African Union, Moussa Faki and President Nana Akufo-Addo and others. And they are standing up and saying these really beautiful words of solidarity. But then, as you pointed out, we know that they are not as vociferous and not as condemnatory about those same types of challenges right there on the continent where they sit.
Where I can maybe try and draw the tiniest bit of optimism is the deep moments of reflection that I think a lot of white Americans are, for the first time in this generation, contemplating is so many of the really difficult realities of a broken social compact between citizen and state, where I think this has a lot of potential implications for US-Africa relations, is a much more honest and hopefully constructive discourse about what it takes to actually repair parts of the fragile social compact. And I think foreign policy and diplomacy is going to have to play really quick catch up, because for a long time we have used sanitizing language to talk about things that are actually really, really difficult. So we use language like human rights abuses. We don't actually talk about what a human rights abuse really looks like.
Our country has massive problems, and we've learned in the last few weeks about the biggest one that it has, which is it's never understood its own history. Our history books don't agree on what our history is.
And so I went back to look at a little of our history. And what I was surprised at is that US diplomats, foreign service officers have been talking inside the corridors of power about racism for a very long time. And occasionally they've talked to African audiences about it, but rarely have we turned in the way that our ambassadors are doing now and talked to the American people about how we as foreign policy professionals understand, reject racism in America. And so I think there's a couple of practical things that we can do. First, I think we can use our platform to connect what's happening in America and what's happening in Africa, to raise African voices, to give a space for conversation. These conversations are important, but we have to share them. We have to share them with Americans, and we have to share them with our African partners and African publics. And then I think that there's a number of tangible things that we can actually do about both fixing the way that our own country works, but fixing the way that we present to
American foreign policy, when it is at its best, is a policy that starts at home. It is a policy that reflects our fundamental values, principles, and tenets. It is a set of policies that are most reflected in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. When we are not at our best at home, living up to the values and principles that are most important to us, we are less able to be influential overseas.